13 dispatch. The whole bridge just fell down. The whole bridge just collapsed.
The U.S. city of Baltimore, a major bridge has collapsed into the water after being struck by a cargo ship.
For nearly half a century, it was one of America's most important crossings. Every day, tens of thousands of vehicles passed over Baltimore's Francis Scott Key Bridge, and beneath it, some of the world's largest cargo ships entered and left one of the busiest ports on the East Coast. They carried billions of dollars in cargo, ranging from cars and farm equipment to construction machinery and military cargo. It wasn't America's biggest bridge or its most famous, but it connected an entire region and kept billions of dollars in trade moving every year. Then, on the early morning of March 26, 2024, it all came crashing down. A massive container ship suddenly lost power. Moments later, it slammed directly into one of the bridge's main support piers, and within seconds, one of America's most important pieces of infrastructure disappeared into the Patapsco River. But this wasn't simply a story about one bridge collapsing. It was a story decades in the making. So how did one of the country's most important bridges become the center of one of the biggest infrastructure disasters in modern American history? To understand that, we have to go back to why the bridge was built in the first place. By the middle of the 20th century, Baltimore was booming. Its harbor had grown into one of America's most productive ports, while the city itself had become a major manufacturing and industrial center. Steel mills, shipyards, automobile imports, and heavy industry attracted workers from across the country. But there was one major problem. Getting around the city was becoming increasingly difficult. Anyone traveling east or west had little choice but to drive through downtown Baltimore or take long detours around the harbor. As traffic exploded during the 1950s and 60s, congestion became a daily frustration and threatened to slow both commuters and commercial transport. Transportation planners envisioned a complete beltway around Baltimore, Interstate 695, that would allow traffic to bypass the city center altogether. But there was just one obstacle: the Patapsco River. Building a conventional bridge across the harbor wasn't straightforward. The entrance to the Port of Baltimore had to remain open to ocean-going vessels, meaning any crossing needed to provide enough clearance for massive ships while spanning one of the busiest navigation channels on the East Coast. Engineers evaluated multiple options before settling on a continuous steel truss bridge with a central span stretching over the shipping channel. When it opened in 1977, the Francis Scott Key Bridge completed the final missing link of the Baltimore Beltway. Rising nearly 185 feet above the water, it gave ships room to pass below while carrying traffic high overhead. Over the next 5 decades, it grew into a critical link for the American economy. Around 30,000 vehicles crossed it every day, but the bridge remained unchanged. However, the ships sailing underneath it changed entirely. One of those ships was the Dali. Built in 2015, it stretched 984 feet from bow to stern. Loaded with over 4,000 containers, the Dali weighed close to 100,000 tons. When the Key Bridge opened in 1977, ships that size did not exist. On March 26, 2024, just after midnight, 2 tugboats pulled the Dali away from the Seagirt Marine Terminal. It was headed for Colombo, Sri Lanka, with a crew of 21 aboard and 2 harbor pilots guiding it out. The captain had reported the ship in good working order. At 1:07 a.m., the tugs got released, and the Dali moved into the Fort McHenry Channel under its own power. At 1:24 a.m., the ship went completely dark. Alarms sounded across the bridge. The engine shut down. The steering failed. In an instant, a 100,000-ton vessel became a drifting object with a bridge less than a mile ahead of it. Emergency generators restored partial power. The pilots tried to swing the ship back toward the center of the channel. The lights came back on for a few seconds before going out for the second time. At 1:26 a.m., the pilots called for a tugboat. The nearest one was 3 miles away. They ordered the port anchor dropped in a final attempt to slow the ship or swing it clear. The warning had reached the Maryland Transportation Authority, and 2 police units parked at either end of the span blocked both directions. However, on the southbound lanes, a construction crew was busy filling potholes, working the overnight shift when traffic was the lightest. An officer radioed that he was driving onto the bridge to pull them off, but he couldn't get there in time. At 1:29 a.m., the dolly struck the southwest pier. The impact registered around 30 million pounds of force. The pier gave way, the main span twisted, buckled, and dropped. And just 33 seconds after impact, most of the 1.6-mile bridge was in the Patapsco River. 6 construction workers lost their lives. 1 was pulled out alive. An inspector survived on a section that remained standing. That evening, the Coast Guard called off the rescue and it became a recovery operation. It took weeks to bring all 6 bodies out of the wreckage. The Port of Baltimore shut down within hours. The wreckage blocked the Fort McHenry Channel completely, sealing off the only deep water route into the harbor. Ships already inside couldn't leave. Ships outside couldn't enter. Baltimore is the busiest port in America for cars and light trucks. It handles more farm and construction machinery than any other U.S. port. Around 8,000 jobs depend directly on it, and tens of thousands more across the region. All of it stopped. Cargo was rerouted to New York, Norfolk, and Philadelphia. Trucking companies rerouted around the missing bridge, adding time and cost to every delivery that used to cross it. The 30,000 vehicles that had crossed the Key Bridge every day now funneled into Baltimore's 2 harbor tunnels, or drove the long way around. The federal response was to cover the full cost of the rebuild, and the Congress later wrote that commitment into law. But the more important part was the investigation. The NTSB spent more than a year and a half taking apart what happened in the dolly's electrical system and concluded that the ship lost power because of a single loose wire. One loose connection in the dolly's electrical circuit opened a breaker, which shut down the pumps that fed cooling water to the main engine. The steering went offline, the ship went dark, and drifted toward the bridge less than a mile away. The crew got power back quickly after the first blackout. Had that been the end of it, the dolly might have recovered in time. It wasn't the end of it because of a second problem that the investigation found to be a result of malpractice. The dolly had 4 generators. 2 of them were being supplied with fuel by a piece of equipment called a flushing pump. When the ship blacked out, the flushing pump stopped and did not come back on. The 2 generators it fed lost their fuel supply, and the dolly blacked out a second time. This time, it was far too close to the bridge to recover. The NTSB called the use of that pump inappropriate and found that there was a pattern behind it. The dolly had been using the flushing pump to supply fuel since at least 2020. Another vessel operated by the same company, the Maersk Saltoro, had suffered a blackout in December 2022 connected to the same use of a flushing pump. In May 2026, more than 2 years after the collapse, the Justice Department brought an 18-count criminal indictment against the ship's operators, Synergy Marine in Singapore and Synergy Maritime in Chennai, India. The charges included conspiracy, failing to immediately inform the Coast Guard of a known hazardous condition, obstruction, and false statements. The indictment's central claim was blunt. If the dolly had been using proper fuel pumps, it would have regained power in time to pass safely under the bridge. The collapse generated dozens of claims from the federal government to the state of Maryland, the city and county of Baltimore, the families of the deceased, and the cargo owners. In 2024, the dolly's owner and operator settled with the Justice Department for more than $100 million. In April 2026, with the civil trial approaching, Maryland reached a settlement in principle with Grace Ocean, the ship's owner, and Synergy Marine, its operator. The state finalized it the following month at $2.25 billion, described as the largest legal recovery in maritime history. Maryland's Attorney General called it the full measure of accountability the state could secure from the ship's owners, and noted the pursuit of justice wasn't finished. By late May 2026, more than 30 settlements had been reached across the litigation, including with the families of the dead and with the worker who survived the fall into the river. But while all of this was ongoing, a bigger question lingered. How did a single vessel take down a bridge carrying an interstate highway? Yes, the collapse was caused by a ship that lost power. But what made March 26th catastrophic was that when it happened, nothing protected the bridge. What the investigations revealed was that the bridge had been carrying this vulnerability for 40 years. The Francis Scott Key Bridge was designed in the early 1970s, and the ships it was built to live alongside were a fraction of the size of the one that destroyed it. When the bridge opened in 1977, a large container ship might carry a few thousand tons. The Dolly, leaving Baltimore in 2024, weighed close to 100,000 tons fully loaded. By 2024, container ships passing under the Key Bridge on average were roughly 4 times heavier than anything its designers had planned for. The bridge had not changed while the ships had transformed completely. This is the economics that reshaped global shipping over the bridge's lifetime, and the warning signs of a coming disaster were already there. 2 years before the Dolly, on a January morning in 2022, the Fern Hollow Bridge in Pittsburgh collapsed on its own. It simply failed and fell into the ravine below, taking several vehicles and a city bus with it. The NTSB investigated and found that the collapse was the result of maintenance and oversight failures across multiple agencies. The bridge's problems had been documented in inspection after inspection for years. The repairs those inspections called for were never made. Inspectors had failed to properly identify the fracture-critical points on the bridge's legs. The bridge had been rated in poor condition for years, but taking it out of service was inconvenient and fixing it was expensive until the morning it was decided for everyone. Fern Hollow and the Key Bridge failed for different immediate reasons. One from neglect of its own structure, one from a ship it was never protected against. But the country had lived through a similar disaster much earlier, just 3 years after the Key Bridge opened. On the morning of May 9, 1980, the freighter Summit Venture was moving through Tampa Bay in a blinding squall when it lost visibility, drifted out of the channel, and struck a support pier of the Sunshine Skyway Bridge. A 1,200-foot section of the bridge fell 150 feet into the bay. 6 cars, a truck, and a Greyhound bus went into the water. 35 people died. The ship that caused it weighed under 20,000 tons, less than a quarter of the Dolly. The Sunshine Skyway disaster changed how America built bridges. When Florida replaced the fallen span, it built a cable-stayed bridge raised higher over the water with a wider channel. They ringed the piers with massive rock islands at the base, and freestanding concrete and rock barriers called dolphins set in the water around the approaches. The base was designed to absorb the impact of a wayward ship before it could ever reach the structure. The dolphins on the new Skyway were engineered to withstand nearly 30 million pounds of force. Ships the size of the Dolly pass in and out of Tampa Bay regularly, and the combination of dolphins and rock islands makes it nearly impossible for one of them to reach the bridge itself. The Key Bridge had opened 3 years before the Skyway fell. It was never retrofitted with any of the protections the Skyway disaster produced. Its piers had a minimal fender system and a pair of dolphins, but nothing built to stop a modern ship. For 44 years, the bridge stood across the mouth of Baltimore's harbor, while the ships passing under it grew 4 times heavier, and the protection around its piers stayed where it had been in 1977. After the collapse, the NTSB looked at whether the Key Bridge's vulnerability could have been known in advance. It could have. That's because the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials publishes a method for calculating a bridge's risk of catastrophic collapse from a ship strike. You feed in the size and frequency of the vessels actually passing under the bridge and the bridge's own characteristics, and it calculates the probability of collapse against an acceptable threshold. For a critical bridge, the accepted standard is a risk of roughly 1 collapse in 10,000 years. The Maryland Transportation Authority never ran it on the Key Bridge. The NTSB found that had they done the assessment using the ships actually transiting the harbor, they would have learned that the bridge was nearly 30 times above the acceptable risk threshold for a critical bridge. The vulnerability wasn't hidden in some unforeseeable place. It was a number the agency that owned the bridge had simply never calculated. The NTSB chair said the collapse was preventable, and the report faulted the lack of any countermeasures to reduce the bridge's vulnerability. That failure to learn came with disastrous consequences, and similar conditions are currently ailing a lot of American infrastructure. But before we talk about that, let's turn focus to what's under construction in place of the old bridge. Nothing could be built until the old bridge came out of the water, and a chunk of it was lying on top of a container ship. Roughly 50,000 tons of steel and concrete had gone into the Patapsco. A 10 million pound section of truss sat across the Dolly's bow, pinning the ship in place. The rest was scattered across the bottom of the 700 feet wide Fort McHenry Federal Channel. It was the only deep-water route into the Port of Baltimore that was now completely impassable. With millions lost in economic activity every day, Baltimore needed its bridge back immediately. The cleanup was organized as a unified command, bringing together the Army Corps of Engineers, the Coast Guard, the Navy's Salvage Division, Maryland state agencies, and contractors working for the ship's operator. At its peak, the operation involved more than 1,200 people, including over 550 contract specialists working as divers, crane operators, and vessel controllers. The Patapsco in early spring is cold and almost black with sediment, and divers working the wreckage often could not see their own hands. They worked by feel, mapping twisted steel in near-zero visibility in a debris field where a shifting section could kill them. Some of the largest floating cranes on the East Coast were brought in. The biggest was the Chesapeake 1000, capable of lifting 1,000 tons at a time. Even that was not enough for the heaviest sections, which had to be cut down before they could be lifted at all. Removal began 4 days after the collapse. By April 2nd, the first temporary channel was open for shallow draft vessels. 3 more followed. By April 25th, a limited access channel 300 feet wide and 35 feet deep was operating, enough for some commercial traffic to move. It took 11 weeks after the collapse to clear out the channel entirely. The Port of Baltimore was open again. Then the state had to decide what to build and what it would cost. Rebuilding what fell was never an option. The original was a steel truss with a 1,200-foot main span designed to 1970s standards, and current national bridge guidelines require something considerably larger. What Maryland is building instead is a cable-stayed bridge, a fundamentally different structure. 2 towers rise more than 600 feet above the Patapsco, each carrying a fan of steel cables that suspends the roadway beneath them. The main span runs 1,665 feet, nearly 40% longer than the bridge it replaces, which pushes the support piers farther from the shipping channel. The deck sits 230 feet above the water instead of 185, clearing the larger vessels now calling at Baltimore. The full structure runs more than 2 miles with 2 12-foot lanes in each direction, and it is designed to stand for 100 years. The first estimate had come out on April 4th, 9 days after the collapse, between $1.7 and $1.9 billion, with the new bridge open by the fall of 2028. No design existed at that point, and once the actual engineering began, every assumption underneath the estimated figure came apart. The pier protection is where the largest single cost increase happened. The old bridge had 2 dolphins, each 28 feet wide, positioned near the main pylons. The dolly drifted between them without touching either one and struck the pylon with roughly 5 times the lateral force that structure could withstand. The new bridge is being ringed with rigid fenders larger than a football field, supported by 276 concrete-filled steel piles driven into the riverbed, each pile 8 feet in diameter. That system alone costs around $1 billion. close to a quarter of the entire project budget, and has proved harder to engineer than expected. Further cost escalations were caused by a moving market. Steel and concrete prices climbed sharply between 2024 and 2025 across every category the project needed, to the point that the state's executive director said he could not break the increases down by material, only that costs across all aspects of the project had risen drastically. Governor Moore attributed much of it to federal trade policy raising the price of essential materials. On November 17, 2025, Maryland released updated figures. The rebuild would cost between $4.3 and $5.2 billion. The opening moved from late 2028 to late 2030. The price had roughly tripled. The schedule had slipped by 2 years. For context, the original Key Bridge cost about $141 million to build in the 1970s, around $568 million in today's money. The replacement will cost close to 9 times that. Construction is underway now. The design reached 70% completion in 14 months. By early 2026, the skyline over the Patapsco carried cranes, barges, and steel piles. Demolition of the remaining sections of the old bridge continued through the winter. The first permanent piles went into the riverbed. As of April 2025, Maryland had spent $111 million, including $77.3 million on salvage and debris removal alone. Then, in the spring of 2026, the state cut ties with Kiewit, the contractor hired to design and build the bridge, citing the cost estimates the firm had produced. Maryland announced it would competitively bid the construction work instead. Kiewit had been the only company to submit a proposal for the original arrangement. A project already 2 years behind schedule changed builders before the main construction phase began. The current target is late 2030. As construction continues, the uncomfortable question after Baltimore is how many other bridges carry the same exposure. The problem with America's infrastructure. In March 2025, the NTSB issued urgent recommendations and identified dozens of bridges across the country that were never assessed for ship strike risk against current vessel traffic. The Key Bridge was 47 years old when it fell. There are about 623,000 bridges in the United States. The average one is 47 years old, and the average bridge was designed to last 50. The country built an enormous share of its bridges in a concentrated burst in the middle of the 20th century, during the construction of the interstate highway system, and that entire generation of structures is now arriving at the end of its design life at roughly the same time. The Key Bridge wasn't an outlier in age, it was the average. When you sort American bridges by condition, the picture is of a system aging faster than it's being renewed. As of the most recent national assessment, about 6.8% of bridges, more than 46,000 of them, are rated in poor condition, meaning they're still carrying traffic but need significant repair. Another 49% are rated only fair. For the first time, the number of bridges in fair condition has surpassed the number rated good. A fair-rated bridge is not a safe bridge, especially without maintenance. The reason these bridges age into poor condition is almost always the same. The money to maintain them doesn't arrive until something forces it. The American Society of Civil Engineers, which grades the country's infrastructure every 4 years, gives America's bridges a C. To bring them all into a state of good repair, the Society estimates a funding gap of $373 billion over 10 years. The 2021 federal infrastructure law put roughly $40 billion toward bridges, which helped, and the percentage of bridges in poor condition has slowly declined as a result. But the broader gap is widening. Across all categories of American infrastructure, the Society estimates an investment gap of $3.7 trillion over the next decade, up from $2.6 trillion 4 years earlier. The pattern underneath these numbers is the one the Key Bridge demonstrated. Maintenance is cheaper than replacement, and prevention is cheaper than disaster, but maintenance and prevention are invisible. A bridge that doesn't fall generates no headlines and no urgency, and so the spending that would keep it standing gets deferred year after year until the bridge fails and the cost arrives all at once. Not $1.7 billion for a planned replacement, but $5.2 billion for an emergency one, plus 11 weeks of a closed port, plus 6 lives. The new Key Bridge will open around 2030, taller and stronger than what it replaces, built for the ships that actually exist rather than the ones that existed in 1977. It is the right bridge. The question the whole story leaves behind is how many of the other 623,000 bridges in the country are waiting for their own version of the dolly. It remains to be seen whether any of them will be fixed before it arrives, or only after. What did you think of this video and the problem with America's infrastructure? Comment your thoughts below. If you enjoyed this video, check out our documentary on the biggest mega project in every US state. Keep following SIGNUM for more stories behind the world's biggest mega builds.